Washington suddenly was filled with a verve and a style and a hum of youthful energy. Politicians in the White House were on some evenings outnumbered by writers and artists. The respect for excellence and disdain for mediocrity which had early become a part of John Kennedy's life, he now proposed to make a part of the nation's life as well.
I look forward to an America which will not be afraid of grace and beauty, which will protect the beauty of our natural environment, which will preserve the great old American houses and squares and parks of our national past, and which will build handsome and balanced cities for our future. I look forward to an America which will reward achievement in the arts as we reward achievement in business or statecraft. And I look forward to an America which commands respect throughout the world, not only for its strength, but for its civilization as well.
He treated us to beauty, and we got used to a new kind of relaxed elegance which seemed natural in the White House. Those who worked with him, meantime, got used to a new kind of decision-making. That hand kept reaching out, one advisor remembers, and when that hand reached out, you were supposed to fill it with another paper. Lord Harlech.
This was always very characteristic of him, that he liked fast conversation. He couldn't bear somebody who explained a problem in enormous length. He wanted them to come to the conclusion. He liked to get to the nub of the thing, and he developed all along a heightened ability to go for the main points and grasp the main points and then bring them to a simple conclusion and from that make decisions.
He made decisions with a vitality and drive which the office of the presidency had never seen before, and with an attention to detail that astonished and sometimes exhausted his subordinates and his friends. Charles Bartlett.
The most depressing thing that could happen to you as a friend of John Kennedy was to have him call up at 8 o'clock in the morning when you were still sort of pulling yourself together, and he would want to discuss how the newspapers had treated some aspect of his program. And of course, if you hadn't read any of the columns or you hadn't even seen the newspapers, why, you were at a distinct loss. And I think people that received these calls got in the habit of having digested the papers rather early.
And again, illustrating the tremendous diversity of this man's ability to absorb, learn, and apply his talents to a job, he took the role of commander-in-chief very seriously.
General Clifton.
And when he read in the intelligence report early that most of the fatalities or bad wounds in Laos were a result of the shoes that were being issued pierced by bamboo spikes, he said, why haven't we solved this problem? Let's get a new kind of shoe. And the first thing they did was develop a shoe, and it was developed in 2 months with a steel plate in it. And they haven't had wounds from those bamboo spikes since. And this was his own idea. Now, he was never satisfied with just hearing this or being assured this was being done. He made me go and get the things and drag them in. He wasn't satisfied to hear about it or read about it. You had to produce the item. And he actually took his shoe off to see if this was any kind of a comfortable footgear.
Charles Spaulding.
In order to handle the job the way he would like to handle it, which is not to let it overburden you, and still to do all the things he wanted to do, he found that he had to discipline himself to get the relaxation he needed. In other words, he had to say, oh, I'll swim after lunch, or and then I'll take a nap at a certain time, and I won't let myself stay up past 11. So once he had mastered that, then he literally got so that he could engineer each minute.
One of the things that he really loved about the setup at the White House was the fact that the House and the offices were so close.
Charles Bartlett.
I think it combined all of his worlds and all the things that he loved, and I think he just loved sort of going from one to the other. When he did go from the office to the residential part, while he put the office stuff, the papers, and all the tough decisions behind him, I think a lot has been said about children easing the burdens of Abraham Lincoln in the White House. Well, I think that those children did an immense amount to keep his own life in balance and make up for the burdens that he had.
William Walton.
He was not just a public father. He was fascinated by his children and the way they would weave a net around him and he around them. And he kept telling Caroline about it. I don't really remember whether it was a blue whale or a white whale, but it was a lovely fictitious character that he'd invented. One day he'd sitting in the stern of Honey Fitz telling her another whale story, and Franklin Roosevelt Jr. was sitting beside him with his legs crossed and his shoes off and wearing a very dirty pair of sweat socks. And as the president told the story, he said that the whale, one of the delicacies that he liked the most were old, dirty sweat socks. And he reached over and grabbed one off of Franklin's foot and threw it over the stern, and kept on the story saying that the only thing he liked more was the second sock, and reached over and took it off and threw it over the stern. And Caroline watched with absolute rapt fascination as the socks disappeared under the water because she thought the whale had them.
Such days as that one were rare in the 34-month presidency of John F. Kennedy. In the third month, an American-aided invasion force of Cuban exiles was wiped out at the Bay of Pigs. In the fifth month, Kennedy met Khrushchev in Vienna and found him tough, shrewd, and unyielding. In the seventh month, a communist wall knifed through Berlin. The president, who might have preferred to give his attention to his ambitious domestic program, to his imaginative Peace Corps, and his fledgling Alliance for Progress, constantly confronted international crisis instead. In October 1962, missile bases were discovered in Cuba, and he confronted the greatest crisis of all. Walt Rostow.
The president's closest advisors rushed to the White House for emergency meetings. We began a process of continuous discussion and analysis. All possible alternatives are discussed. Invade, bomb the missile sites, blockade Cuba from the sea. It's not an easy thing to decide to commit the United States absolutely to the use of force in a crisis should deterrence fail, because it doesn't convey persuasively unless it's meant. There's a mysterious accuracy in communications of this kind. Once a president says, yes, I will see it all the way through if necessary, this is somehow understood. It cannot be conveyed by trickery. The president has to decide, and this is a heavy burden.
What the president decided was to see it all the way through.
We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the course of worldwide nuclear war, in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. But neither will we shrink from that risk at any time it must be faced. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Robert Kennedy.
What he was doing was making a decision not just for this generation of Americans, but the next generation, unborn, and for young people all over the world who really didn't have any role in this decision and didn't have any part to play. And therefore their future, or whether they would have a future, was really up to him.
Charles Bartlett.
Even during the Cuban Missile Crisis, during that 2-week period, we were there for dinner, I think, twice, and it was really amazing that here he was under this enormous, crushing burden, and yet he could turn it off for an hour or so and go back to it very quickly. And he discussed it even while they were there, but he could turn it off and go through the normal routine of dinner. And there were always those men waiting with brown envelopes. Just in the middle, the man would come in and it would say, eyes only, the president, and hand it to him. And you just felt so sorry for a man to have to, in the middle of the evening when he was tired, to have to open this brown envelope and get more bad or threatening news.
But with an armed ring around Cuba and American nuclear bombers in the air ready for attack, the news turned good. Russia loaded the missiles aboard ships and took them home.
When a man's way please the Lord, the scriptures tell us, he maketh even his enemies to be at peace with him. And is not peace, in the last analysis, basically a matter of human rights? The right to live out our lives without fear of devastation, the right to breathe air as nature provided it, the right of future generations to a healthy existence.
Adlai Stevenson.
John F. Kennedy was so contemporary a man, so involved in our world, so immersed in our times, so responsive to its challenges, so intense a participant in the great decisions of our day, that he seemed the very symbol of the vitality and the exuberance that is the essence of life itself. I think it can be truly said that the threat of nuclear war was his greatest burden, and the initiatives he took for peace were his greatest glory.
Jerome Wiesner.
I remember one day when he asked me what happened to the radioactive fallout, and I told him that it was washed out of the clouds by the rain, that it would be brought to earth by rain. And he said, looking out the window, "You mean it's in the rain out there?" And I said, "Yes." And he looked out the window, looked very sad, didn't say a word for several minutes.
When he did speak, it was directly to the hearts and hopes of men.
According to the ancient Chinese proverb, a journey of 1,000 miles must begin with a single step. My fellow Americans, let us take that first step. Let us, if we can, step back from the shadows of war and seek out the way of peace. And if that journey is 1,000 miles, or even more, let history record that we, in this land, at this time, took the first step.
On August 5th, 1963, the United States, on his initiative, took the first step and signed a nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviet Union and Britain. Yesterday, John F. Kennedy told us, a shaft of light cut into the darkness. That same summer, there was darkness and strife of another kind at home.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the Scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated.
The Negro Revolution had begun, and he held great power over its future. He might have tried to turn it into safer channels, or dilute it, or postpone it. Instead, he joined it as a partisan.
If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay?
The last great battle of his presidency was for a strong law guaranteeing the civil rights of all his countrymen.
Those who do nothing are inviting shame as well as violence. Those who act boldly are recognizing right as well as reality. Next week, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it has not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
That battle was not yet won when, in mid-November 1963, he decided to make a trip to Texas. A momentary pause in the affairs of men had come just then, a kind of lull in the atmosphere of crisis, and it allowed him to stop off first for a long weekend in Florida. He invited his old Harvard roommate, Torbert MacDonald, to stay with him.
For once, it was pleasant. Usually that wind blows this time of year, you know. Wind just blows and blows. You have to hide from the wind. But this time, 4 pleasant days, not a cloud in the sky. And Dave was along. And I stayed at the house with Jack. And it was like back in 1939 where there was nothing of any moment on anybody's mind. It wasn't the usually tension-filled weekend, and came down, I guess, on a Friday or so, and spent a pleasant Saturday and Sunday and Monday, and he left pick up Jackie to go to Texas.
In Dallas, Texas, at 30 minutes after noon on November 22nd, 1963, in one black instant, his life ended. It was long afterwards, when there was time to reflect on it, that we remembered something he had said, and realized then what his greatest gift to us was. He showed us how a life can be lived.
The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, and spends himself in a worthy cause, who at best, if he wins, knows the thrills of high achievement, and if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat,